The sound of glass shattering downstairs pulled Alara Morgan from her botany textbook. Third time this week. Her uncle Reed was drunk again. Since taking over the family business after her parents' death, he'd transformed the respected Morgan Pharmaceuticals into an empty shell, consumed by his gambling and disastrous investments. Alara, get down here now. Reed's voice echoed through the old Connecticut mansion. She found him in the study, face pale, hands trembling, a black envelope on the desk. What is it, Uncle? It's over. We've lost everything. Reed ran his hand through his gray hair. Blackwood is taking the company, the house, everything. The name Blackwood made Alara's blood run cold. Xavier Blackwood, the tech billionaire who bought companies across the country just to dismantle them, was known for his ruthlessness and showing no mercy. But there's a way out. Reed looked at her with a disturbing gleam in his eyes. He offered a deal, a contract that would save everything. What kind of contract? Reed pushed the black envelope toward her. Inside was an elegant document with the Blackwood Industries logo at the top. A marriage contract, Reed finally said. He wants you, Alara. The words hit her like a physical blow. Is this some sick joke? Not a joke. It's an agreement our families made long ago. Your parents, they broke the original promise when they ran away together. Now Blackwood is collecting the debt. As Reed explained an ancient pact between the families that sounded like something out of a Gothic novel, Alara felt her world crumbling. I won't sell myself to a man I've never met. This is disgusting. You have no choice. Reed shouted, suddenly desperate. If you don't accept, we won't just lose everything, but they'll come after me. I have debts to dangerous people, Alara. People who wouldn't hesitate to kill me. She looked at her only remaining relative. Despite all his flaws, Reed had taken her in when she was orphaned. The thought of losing him, of being completely alone in the world, was terrifying. How long do I have to decide? Until noon tomorrow. His limo will come for you. That night, alone in her room, Alara swore to herself that although she might give her hand to Xavier Blackwood to save her uncle, she would never give her heart. It would be a marriage on paper only. And somehow, she would find a way to escape this cruel fate. The black limousine wound along the coastal road the next day, taking Alara to her new future. She watched familiar scenery disappear through the rear window, feeling like she was going to her own funeral. A small suitcase containing just essentials rested beside her, her only connection to the life she was leaving behind. The Blackwood complex in Newport, Rhode Island, was a modern fortress, glass and steel walls rising above cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. A stark contrast to the old Victorian mansion of the Morgans. When the limousine stopped at the main entrance, Alara took a deep breath. You can do this, she murmured to herself, smoothing the simple navy blue dress she'd chosen for the occasion. Sober, unpretentious, and emotional armor. A gray-haired woman with impeccable posture greeted her at the entrance. Miss Morgan, I'm Mrs. Montgomery, Mr. Blackwood's housekeeper. He's waiting for you in his office. As she followed along the minimalist corridors, Alara noticed security cameras at every corner and staff who avoided her gaze. The entire place seemed to function with the precision of a Swiss watch, cold and methodical. Two imposing dark wood doors opened, revealing a spacious office overlooking the ocean. With his back to her, a tall man watched the waves breaking on the rocks below. Mr. Blackwood, Miss Morgan is here, announced Mrs. Montgomery, immediately withdrawing. Xavier Blackwood turned slowly. Alara had expected to see an older man, perhaps with obvious traits of cruelty and excess, but what she saw left her momentarily speechless. He couldn't be more than 35. His greenish-gray eyes assessed her with clinical coldness, while his dark hair, slightly tousled by the wind, contrasted with the impeccable suit he wore. He was undeniably attractive, but there was something unsettling about his beauty, a hardness in his eyes, as if he were looking at an object, not a person. So you're the last Morgan, he finally said, his voice deep and controlled. I expected more, considering the inconvenience your ancestors caused my family. The comment ignited a spark of anger in Alara. And I expected someone who didn't need to buy a wife, Mr. Blackwood. Seems we're both disappointed. A brief flash of surprise crossed his features before transforming into a cold smile. I like knowing exactly what I'm acquiring, Miss Morgan. Business is business, and this marriage is just another transaction. A transaction that saves my uncle's life, she replied, lifting her chin in defiance. Ah, yes. Reed Morgan. Xavier walked to his desk, picking up a file. A compulsive gambler, alcoholic, and recently, a debtor to some rather dangerous people. A man who lost his family's company and almost ruined the legacy your parents worked so hard to build. Each word was like a needle, precise and painful. If you know me so well, you must know I'm not like him. What I know is that you're a virgin at 22, graduated in botany and biochemistry with honors, no significant previous relationships, and most importantly, carry the DNA I need to complete this agreement. How do you? I know everything about you, Alara. Your medical history, your school grades, even what you like to eat for breakfast. Xavier closed the file and stared at her. Our wedding will take place in 1 week. It will be discreet, with only a judge and the necessary witnesses present. Until then, you'll remain here to get accustomed to your new home. And if I change my mind? Xavier's smile widened, revealing perfect teeth, like a predator about to attack. Then your uncle will face the consequences of his debts, and you'll be completely alone in the world, without a penny or a place to call home. The choice is yours, of course. Alara swallowed hard, feeling the trap closing around her. What's the real reason for all this, Mr. Blackwood? Why me? For an instant, something dark and vulnerable crossed his gaze, so quickly that Alara almost believed she'd imagined it. Mrs. Montgomery will show you to your quarters. We dine at 7. Don't be late. With that, he turned back to the window, abruptly ending the conversation and leaving Alara with more questions than answers. The next 7 days passed in a blur of silent dinners and exploration of the vast estate. Xavier was rarely present, always occupied with business calls or locked away in his private office. On the rare occasions they crossed paths, their interactions were minimal and coldly polite. The only place Alara found solace was the greenhouse on the east wing, a glass sanctuary filled with rare plants that Mrs. Montgomery informed her had been prepared specifically for her arrival. Though Alara wanted to resent this calculated move to appease her, she couldn't help but feel grateful for the space. On the morning of their wedding, Alara stood in her assigned bedroom, staring at her reflection. The dress provided for her was elegant but simple, ivory silk that flowed to the floor with minimal embellishment. She looked like a bride but felt like a prisoner walking to her cell. The ceremony was exactly as Xavier had described, clinical and brief. A judge, Mrs. Montgomery, and Xavier's lawyer as witnesses. No flowers, no music, no celebration. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier placed a platinum band on her finger without emotion and gave her a chaste kiss on the cheek for appearance's sake. Congratulations, Mrs. Blackwood, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. The first phase of our arrangement is complete. That night, after a silent dinner where Xavier seemed more focused on his phone than his new wife, he escorted her to a set of rooms adjacent to his own. These are your quarters, he explained, opening the door to a beautifully appointed suite. My rooms are through that connecting door, but it remains locked from both sides. I have no intention of forcing any physical relationship between us. Alara's surprise must have shown on her face, because Xavier's expression hardened. Don't misunderstand me. This isn't sentiment. The terms of our arrangement specify a marriage, not a romance. The connection between our families requires legal union, not consummation. What connection? Alara pressed, seizing the opportunity. You keep alluding to some historic agreement between our families, but you never explain what it actually is. Xavier studied her for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. Your grandfather and mine were research partners decades ago. They made a discovery that could change medicine forever, but they disagreed on its application. Your grandfather wanted to share it with the world immediately. Mine believed it needed more testing, more refinement. He walked to the window, his profile sharp against the moonlight. The partnership dissolved bitterly. Your grandfather took half the research and formed Morgan Pharmaceuticals. Mine kept the other half. Neither could proceed without the other's work. And this marriage somehow fixes that. The original agreement was that the firstborn of the next generations would unite the families, bringing the research back together. Xavier turned back to her. Your parents were supposed to honor this, but they refused, choosing to marry for sentiment. The way he said the word made it sound like a disease. So this is about research? Intellectual property? Alara struggled to comprehend. You married me to get access to pharmaceutical patents? The situation is more complex than that. The work our grandfathers began isn't just valuable, it's revolutionary. And there are genetic components that make our specific union necessary. Before Alara could question him further, Xavier moved toward the door. Get some rest. Tomorrow, Mrs. Montgomery will show you the full estate and explain your duties as Mrs. Blackwood. There will be public appearances, charity events, and social obligations to fulfill. Our marriage may be a business arrangement, but to the world, we must appear devoted. After he left, Alara collapsed onto the bed, mind racing. This marriage wasn't just about saving her uncle or settling old family scores. It involved scientific research valuable enough to force a union between unwilling participants. But what kind of research could possibly justify such extreme measures? More disturbing was the mention of genetic components. What had Xavier meant by that? Did her very DNA have something to do with this arrangement? As she prepared for bed, Alara noticed a leather-bound book on the nightstand. Opening it, she found a note in elegant handwriting. The Morgan Blackwood Project files. Read them if you wish to understand why you're here. X. The file contains scientific papers, correspondence between her grandfather and Xavier's, and research notes on something called Project Renaissance. Most of the technical details were beyond her understanding, but certain phrases jumped out. Cellular regeneration, neurological synchronicity, and most disturbing of all, genetic compatibility between bloodlines. The last page was a handwritten note from Xavier's father to hers, dated just weeks before both sets of parents died in separate accidents. James, we must stop Reed before it's too late. He's falsifying results, pushing for premature release. This formula isn't ready. It could cost lives. If anything happens to Elizabeth and me, protect Alara. The genetic marker is strongest in her. Alara's hands trembled as she closed the file. Her Uncle Reed was involved in this somehow, and her parents' death may not have been the accident she'd always believed. Outside her window, thunder rumbled as storm clouds gathered over the Atlantic. As the first raindrops hit the glass, Alara heard something unexpected, a muffled cry from behind the connecting door to Xavier's rooms. Against her better judgment, she pressed her ear to the door. Another cry, followed by what sounded like breaking glass. Without thinking, she tried the handle. To her surprise, it turned. Xavier's room was in disarray, sheets twisted, a lamp shattered on the floor. In the center of the king-sized bed, Xavier thrashed violently, caught in the grip of a nightmare. No, get away from them. Dad, Mom, he shouted, fighting invisible enemies. Alara rushed to him, grabbing his shoulders. Xavier, wake up. It's just a nightmare. His eyes flew open, unfocused and terrified. For a moment, he didn't seem to recognize her, his hands gripping her wrists hard enough to bruise. It's me, Alara. You're safe. Recognition finally dawned in his eyes, followed by something that looked like shame. Xavier released her immediately, pulling away. Get out, he ordered, his voice hoarse. You're hurt. I can call someone, or, I said get out. The shout came loaded with vulnerability that contradicted his usually controlled demeanor. Alara stepped back, but didn't leave the room. Instead, she walked to the window and closed the heavy curtains, diminishing the impact of lightning flashes. Then, without a word, she went to the adjoining bathroom and returned with a glass of water. Xavier watched her with a mixture of anger and confusion. You have nightmares during storms, she said simply, extending the glass. Related to your parents. He accepted the water, avoiding her gaze. How did you? You called out for them. Alara sat on the edge of the bed, maintaining a respectful distance. How long has this been happening? A long silence followed, interrupted only by the sound of rain against the windows. When Alara was about to give up and leave, Xavier finally spoke. Since I was 10, the night they died, there was a storm like this. The confession hung between them, heavy and unexpected. What happened to them? Alara asked softly. Xavier rose abruptly, walking to a private bar in the corner of the room. He poured himself a whiskey, drinking it in one gulp. A car accident, officially. His bitter tone suggested there was more to the story. They were returning from a meeting with their new research partners. The Morgans. The words hit Alara like a physical blow. My parents. Your parents, Xavier confirmed, pouring himself another shot. James and Elizabeth Morgan, The brilliant scientist who stole my father's research and then betrayed him. That can't be true, Alara protested. My parents were people of integrity. They would never. You were only 8 when they died. What do you really know about them besides the stories Reed told you? The bitterness in his voice was palpable. Curious how your parents died in equally mysterious circumstances just 2 years after mine, isn't it? A particularly strong thunder made the mansion tremble, and Xavier involuntarily shuddered. Without thinking, Alara approached him, lightly touching his arm. Is that the reason for all this? The contract, the forced marriage? Revenge against my dead parents? Xavier looked at her hand on his arm, but didn't pull away. It's more complicated than you imagine. Then explain it to me, she challenged. After everything you're putting me through, I deserve to know the truth. He stared at her for a long time, as if deciding how much to reveal. There was revolutionary research, he finally began. Something that could change the world of medicine forever. My father worked on it for decades, dedicated his life to it. Then he met your parents at a conference and believed he had found the perfect partners to finalize the project. For the next hour, as the storm gradually subsided outside, Xavier revealed the complex history connecting their families. Project Renaissance, a regenerative medicine that could cure degenerative diseases and heal traumatic injuries, required the combined expertise of both families. As their parents worked together, they discovered something unexpected, a genetic marker present in both Xavier and Alara that could stabilize the formula. So the marriage contract wasn't just about uniting the companies? Alara asked. It was about uniting specific genetic codes, Xavier confirmed. But then your parents betrayed mine, stole critical components of the research, and disappeared. Weeks later, my parents died in that accident. The implications settled over Alara like a heavy blanket. And you believe my parents had something to do with their death? I have evidence. 3 days later, Alara stood before a full-length mirror, barely recognizing herself in the emerald evening gown. Tonight would be their first public appearance as a married couple, the annual Blackwood Foundation Charity Ball. The event attracts the elite from across the East Coast, Mrs. Montgomery explained while adjusting Alara's dress. It's vital that you present yourselves as genuinely in love. A challenging performance, Alara muttered. When she descended the grand staircase, she found Xavier waiting in the foyer. Dressed in an impeccable tuxedo, he looked even more imposing. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, and Alara could swear she saw admiration in his usually cold gaze. You look suitable, he said, offering his arm. Your compliment moves me, Mr. Blackwood, she responded with false sweetness. A brief smile touched his lips. Tonight, I'm Xavier, and you're my beloved wife, madly in love after our whirlwind marriage. Quite a performance. A necessary one. The more convincing we are, the fewer uncomfortable questions we'll have to answer. The charity ball was a display of power and wealth unlike anything Alara had ever witnessed. Held in one of Newport's most prestigious ballrooms, the event gathered the business and social elite of the East Coast. Everyone seemed eager to meet the mysterious woman who had captured the heart of the untouchable Xavier Blackwood. So you're the girl who achieved the impossible, an elegant woman with platinum hair commented, looking Alara up and down. Vivian Harrington. Xavier and I have a long history together. I'm sure you do, Alara replied politely, feeling Xavier's arm tense beside her. Vivian was just leaving. Xavier intervened, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. The woman shot Alara a venomous look before walking away. She won't be the last resentful ex-lover tonight, he murmured. Keep your glass full and your smile in place. As the night progressed, Alara was surprised by how easily Xavier transitioned between different groups, his calculated charm winning over everyone around him. It was like watching an actor in his best role, the benevolent billionaire donating millions to noble causes, so different from the cold man she knew. Dance with me, he said suddenly, extending his hand as the orchestra began a waltz. On the dance floor, with Xavier's hand firm on her waist, Alara felt a strange connection she hadn't experienced before. Their bodies moved in perfect synchrony, as if they had danced together all their lives. Everyone is watching us, she whispered, aware of the curious glances. Let them look. His voice was low, almost intimate. We're putting on a show, aren't we? As the music intensified, Xavier led her with surprising grace. For a moment, Alara forgot who they were. No longer predator and prey, just a man and a woman dancing under the sparkling lights. The music ceased, but they remained close, Xavier's eyes fixed on hers. There was something different there, a vulnerability she had never seen before. "They expect me to kiss my wife," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. Before Alara could respond, Xavier leaned in and captured her lips in a kiss that started as part of the act, but quickly transformed into something more. An electric current ran through her body when his hand slid to the nape of her neck, deepening the contact. When they finally separated, both seemed equally surprised. Xavier's gaze was clouded by something that looked like confusion and desire. "A convincing performance," Alara managed to say, her heart beating erratically. The moment was interrupted by a sudden crash, a lightning flash followed by the rumble of thunder. The storm that had threatened all night had finally arrived. Xavier visibly paled, his confident posture immediately replaced by palpable tension. "We need to go," he said abruptly, his voice strangely altered. Now, on the drive back to the mansion, amid the pouring rain, Xavier remained silent, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. Lightning illuminated his profile, revealing an expression Alara had never seen: pure terror. The cruel, calculating man who had bought her like merchandise seemed to have been replaced by someone haunted by invisible demons. And for the first time since they met, Alara felt a spark of empathy for the enigmatic Xavier Blackwood. The storm didn't relent all night. Alara woke with a start to the sound of something breaking. She glanced at the digital clock on her nightstand. 3:17 a.m. Another crash, followed by a muffled scream. It came from Xavier's room across the hall. Hesitant, Alara put on her robe and stepped into the corridor. The mansion was dark, illuminated only by occasional lightning flashes through the large windows. She paused at the master bedroom door, momentarily paralyzed by indecision. Should she ignore it and return to her room, pretending she hadn't heard anything? Another scream, desperate and anguished, made the decision for her. "Xavier," she called, knocking lightly on the door. No response, just the sound of objects being knocked over. Alara turned the doorknob, finding it unlocked. The room was in complete chaos: twisted sheets, a broken lamp on the floor, and Xavier in the center of the king-size bed, his body covered in sweat, eyes closed, clearly trapped in a terrible nightmare. "Don't! Get away from them! Dad! Mom!" he screamed, fighting against invisible enemies. Alara rushed to him, holding his shoulders. "Xavier, wake up. It's just a nightmare." His eyes opened abruptly, unfocused and terrified. For an instant, he didn't seem to recognize her, his hands grabbing her wrists with enough force to hurt. "It's me, Alara. You're safe." Recognition finally dawned in his gaze, along with something that looked like shame. Xavier released her immediately, pulling away. "Get out," he ordered, his voice hoarse. "You're bleeding," she noticed, seeing a cut on his hand from the broken lamp. "Let me help." "I said get out." The shout came loaded with a vulnerability that contradicted his habitually controlled demeanor. Alara retreated but didn't leave the room. Instead, she walked to the window and closed the heavy curtains, diminishing the impact of the lightning flashes. Then, without a word, she went to the adjoining bathroom and returned with a first aid kit and a glass of water. Xavier watched her with a mixture of anger and confusion. "The nightmares are always about your parents," she stated rather than asked, cleaning the cut on his hand with gentle movements. "And they come with storms." He remained silent, allowing her to bandage his hand. "How long has this been happening?" she asked quietly. A long silence followed, interrupted only by the sound of rain against the windows. When Alara had almost given up on getting an answer, Xavier finally spoke. "Since I was 10, the night they died, there was a storm like this one. You've never gotten help for this? What would I tell a therapist? That the billionaire CEO of Blackwood Industries is terrified of thunderstorms." His laugh was bitter. "The board would have me removed in a heartbeat." Alara finished bandaging his hand, but didn't move away. "I had night terrors after my parents died. Uncle Reed hired a therapist who taught me coping techniques. Did they work?" "Some did." She looked directly into his eyes. "It gets better, Xavier. It doesn't go away completely, but it gets more manageable with time." Something shifted in his expression, a softening around the edges of his usual hard mask. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, genuine confusion in his voice. "After everything I've done to you, forcing you into this marriage." "I don't know," Alara admitted. "Maybe because right now, you seem human, not the calculating businessman who bought a wife." They sat in silence for several minutes, the storm gradually subsiding outside. The tension in the room had transformed into something different, not comfortable, but no longer hostile. "They were brilliant," Xavier said suddenly. "My parents. They dedicated their lives to helping others. Project Renaissance was supposed to be their legacy, a treatment that could regenerate damaged tissue, cure diseases that were previously incurable. Is that what our grandfathers started?" He nodded. "The original breakthrough happened when they were research partners at MIT. Your grandfather was the botanical expert, mine specialized in genetic applications. Together, they discovered a compound in a rare plant species that, when combined with specific genetic markers, could trigger cellular regeneration. And our parents continued their work. They expanded it. Your mother was a neurobiologist, my father a biochemist. The perfect team." A shadow crossed Xavier's face. "Until your father betrayed them." "You keep saying that, but I find it hard to believe," Alara countered. "From what little I remember, my father was principled to a fault. He turned down lucrative offers from pharmaceutical companies because he didn't agree with their testing protocols. People change when millions are at stake." Xavier got out of bed, walking to his desk. From a drawer, he pulled out a file folder. "These are copies of communications between our parents in the weeks before their deaths." Alara accepted the folder with trepidation. Inside were printouts of emails, memos, and what appeared to be transcripts of recorded conversations. She scanned the documents, her heart sinking as she read what seemed to be increasingly hostile exchanges between her father and Xavier's. The last page was an email dated 2 days before Xavier's parents died, sent from her father's account. "If we don't receive our full payment by Friday, we'll turn everything over to the authorities. You've underestimated our determination. This ends, with or without you." "This doesn't sound like my father," Alara said, voice shaking. "He wouldn't blackmail anyone." 2 days after that email, my parents died on a rain-slicked road when their brakes mysteriously failed. Xavier's voice was flat. "The valuable components of the research disappeared. 2 years later, your parents died in another accident, and your Uncle Reed took control of everything. The company, custody of you, and what remained of their work." Alara's mind raced, connecting pieces she'd never considered before. "If what you're saying is true, why wait all these years? Why not confront Reed directly?" "I needed proof, not just suspicions." Xavier's face hardened. "And I needed access to the remaining Morgan research, which is legally yours, not Reed's. The marriage contract was the cleanest way to reunite the divided project. So this was never about an old family promise? Just business." Xavier hesitated, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. "It started that way. A logical solution to reclaim what was stolen from my family. And now," he looked at her intently, "now I'm not sure. When we kissed tonight." "For show," she reminded him, though her quickened pulse suggested otherwise. "Was it?" he challenged softly. "Because I've kissed women for show before, Alara. It never felt like that." The confession hung between them, as unexpected as the thunder that had triggered this entire conversation. Alara stood, needing distance from the intensity of his gaze. "It's late. We both need rest." "Alara," Xavier called as she reached the door. "Thank you. For tonight." She nodded slightly before closing the door, her emotions in complete turmoil. The man who had bought her freedom for revenge was beginning to reveal layers she had never imagined existed. And worse, she was starting to care. Back in her room, Alara couldn't sleep. She kept returning to the documents Xavier had shown her, unable to reconcile the father she remembered with the man portrayed in those emails. Something felt wrong, off-kilter. She retrieved the leather-bound file Xavier had given her earlier, studying it more carefully. Within the scientific jargon and research notes, patterns emerged that troubled her. Dates that didn't align. Signatures that seemed slightly different from one document to the next. And most concerning, references to modifications of the formula that appeared to come from a third party, neither the Blackwoods nor her parents. On a hunch, she compared the damning email supposedly from her father with other documents he had authored. The writing style was similar but not identical. Her father had been meticulous about certain phrases, never-ending sentences with prepositions, always spelling out numbers under 10. The email contained both errors. As dawn broke, illuminating her room with soft golden light, Alara came to a disturbing conclusion. Someone had gone to great lengths to create conflict between the families. Someone who stood to gain from their mutual destruction. Someone like her Uncle Reed, who had inherited everything when both sets of parents were gone. A light knock at her door startled her. Xavier stood there, dressed in a casual sweater and jeans, a stark departure from his usual formal attire. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. "I kept thinking about what you said, about the nightmares getting better with time." He paused, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "I thought maybe we could have breakfast together. Talk more about our parents, the project. Try to make sense of it all." Alara considered him, this complex man who had entered her life as an enemy, but was rapidly becoming something far more complicated. "I'd like that," she said finally. "And Xavier? I think we need to take a closer look at my Uncle Reed. Something about those emails doesn't feel right." A look of intrigue crossed his face. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I think we've both been manipulated," she replied. "And I'm starting to believe the real villain in this story isn't a Morgan or a Blackwood at all." 3 weeks had passed since the night of the storm, and a strange truce had established itself between Alara and Xavier. They weren't exactly friends, much less a loving couple, but the open hostility had given way to a curious camaraderie, fueled by their mutual desire to uncover the truth about the past. Xavier had begun joining Alara in the greenhouse during the afternoons, bringing his laptop while she worked with her plants. Sometimes they spent hours without exchanging a word, but the silence was no longer oppressive. There was something almost comforting about it. On this particular morning, Alara was pruning a rare orchid species when she noticed Xavier observing her with unusual intensity. "What is it?" she asked, looking up from her work. "You look like her," he responded thoughtfully. "Your mother. I have some old photographs. You have the same focused expression when you work." The casual mention of her mother, not as a villain in his revenge narrative, but as a real person he remembered, caught Alara off guard. "You knew my mother well." Xavier set his laptop aside, leaning back in his chair. "Our family spent a lot of time together before everything fell apart. Elizabeth used to bring me astronomy books because I was obsessed with stars." A sudden memory surfaced in Alara's mind, her mother reading to her about constellations, teaching her to locate the Big Dipper in the night sky. "She loved the stars," Alara murmured. "She used to say we were all made of stardust." For a moment, they shared a different kind of silence, laden with nostalgia for a past they barely remembered. Xavier's phone rang, breaking the spell. His expression turned serious as he answered. "I understand. I'll be there in an hour," he said before hanging up. Turning to Alara, he explained, "An emergency came up at the Boston headquarters. I need to leave immediately." "For how long?" 2 days, maximum." He hesitated for an instant. "Will you be all right here alone?" The question revealed a concern that wouldn't have existed weeks ago. "Of course. I have my plants to keep me company." Xavier nodded, already getting up to leave. At the greenhouse door, he paused, as if remembering something. "My private office will be locked while I'm gone. If you need anything, Mrs. Montgomery can help you." After his departure, Alara continued her work, but her mind wandered. Xavier's private office, the only room in the mansion that remained perpetually closed to her. What did he keep there that was so important to keep secret? That evening, after a solitary dinner, Alara was browsing in the library when she noticed something unusual. The door leading to the corridor of the private office was ajar. Curious, she approached silently. In the corridor, Mrs. Montgomery was speaking on the phone in a low voice, clearly not expecting to be overheard. "Yes, she still doesn't suspect anything. He's in Boston as planned. No complications, except that he seems to be getting attached to her more than we anticipated." Alara froze, her heart racing. Getting attached to her? Who was on the other end of the line? "Reed, you need to be patient. The plan is working perfectly." The mention of her uncle's name made Alara's blood run cold. Reed and Mrs. Montgomery were conspiring? About what? "The documents are exactly where he said they would be. In the office, in the safe behind the Matisse painting." "Yes, I have the combination. He never changed it since he hired me. Tomorrow night, I'll get everything and send it to you." "No, she won't be a problem. The girl is too naive to notice what's happening right under her nose." Alara retreated silently, her mind processing what she had just heard. Her uncle, whom she believed was being protected by this agreement, was working with Xavier's housekeeper, and the target seemed to be documents in Xavier's office, possibly related to the research that both families were disputing. Back in her room, Alara pondered her options. Confronting Mrs. Montgomery would reveal she was aware of the conspiracy. Calling Xavier also didn't seem prudent. What if he was involved somehow? What if this was all a test of her loyalty? After hours of anguish, Alara made her decision. If the documents were in the safe behind the Matisse painting, she needed to see them before they disappeared. She needed to know the truth, however painful it might be. She waited until midnight, when the mansion slept in complete silence. With light steps, she headed to the private office. The door, as expected, was locked. But during her weeks at the mansion, Alara had noticed a detail. The old locks in the West Wing, where the office was located, were all similar to those at the Morgan mansion. And she still had the small lock-picking kit she'd used to unlock her diary as a teenager. With trembling hands, she worked on the lock for a few minutes until she heard the satisfying click. The office was dark, illuminated only by moonlight entering through the large windows. Quickly, she located the mentioned painting, a Matisse work depicting a lush garden. Moving the painting revealed a modern digital safe. The combination, what would it be? Alara tried several possibilities: Xavier's birth date, important company dates. Nothing worked. For a moment, she considered giving up. Then, she remembered the conversation about stars, about her mother and the constellations. On an impulse, she typed in her own birth date. The safe remained closed. Frustrated, Alara leaned against Xavier's desk, accidentally knocking over a folder. As she bent to collect the scattered papers, she noticed a photograph that had slipped under the desk, an old image of 4 adults and 2 small children at an observatory. Her parents and Xavier's, with them as children, looking through a telescope. Turning the photo over, she found a notation: Blackwood Observatory, first observation of the Eridanus supernova. March 14, 1995, could it be? With hesitant fingers, Alara typed 03141995 into the safe. With a soft hum, the door opened. Inside were several meticulously organized folders, digital storage devices, and a small carved wooden box. Alara picked up the folder marked Project Renaissance, the name Xavier had mentioned as being the disputed research. As she leafed through the documents, her heart raced. These weren't evidence against her parents, as Xavier had suggested. They were emails, reports, and notes that told a completely different story. In a memo dated just 1 week before the death of Xavier's parents, her own father, James Morgan, had written, "We discovered manipulation in the laboratory tests. Someone is falsifying results to accelerate approval of the compound. Xavier Sr., we need to stop everything immediately. This medication isn't ready. It could cost lives. We suspect Reed is involved. Elizabeth and I are gathering evidence, but we fear for our lives. If anything happens to us, all the material is stored in our family vault, with instructions to be delivered to Alara when she turns 25. Tears streamed down Alara's face as the truth finally came to light. Her parents weren't villains in this story. They were victims, just like Xavier's parents. And the real culprit appeared to be her own uncle, Reed. Among the documents, she found something even more disturbing: original police reports on her parents' deaths, significantly different from those Xavier had shown her. These clearly indicated sabotage to the car's brake system, and a partial fingerprint that matched Reed. Suddenly, the office light switched on. Alara turned, expecting to find Mrs. Montgomery, but instead saw her Uncle Reed standing in the doorway, a cold smile on his face. "Always so curious, aren't you, dear niece?" he said, advancing slowly. "Exactly like your mother." And see where it led her. Alara backed away, the documents still in her hands. "You killed them. All of them. What? Money, obviously." Reed shrugged, as if discussing something trivial. "Project Renaissance would be worth billions. Your father and Xavier Sr. were brilliant scientists, but terrible businessmen. They wanted to follow protocols, ethical procedures, lose years in additional testing when we had investors willing to pay a fortune immediately. So you falsified results, and when they found out, they became obstacles to be removed. Reed was now dangerously close. Just like you and your dear husband, who, by the way, is having a terrible accident in Boston right at this moment. Alara's world seemed to collapse. What? What have you done to Xavier? Nothing yet. But soon he'll suffer the same fate as his parents. A terrible tragedy, really. And then, as your only living relative and legal guardian until recently, I'll inherit everything. Blackwood Industries, the research, and I'll finally be able to launch the medication through Morgan Pharmaceuticals, now completely under my control. With a quick movement, Reed pulled a small gun from the inner pocket of his jacket. Now, be a good girl and put those documents back in the safe. Nobody needs to get hurt tonight. Alara knew she was in mortal danger. She needed to buy time, find a way to escape, and warn Xavier. How did you get in here? The security. Mrs. Montgomery has been working for me for years. Do you really think Xavier would hire someone without doing a complete background check? He hired her because I orchestrated everything, manipulating the information he would receive. Reed laughed. The great Xavier Blackwood, so smart in business, so easily manipulated when it comes to his obsession with revenge. With growing horror, Alara realized the extent of the plot. You planned all of this. Even the marriage contract. A brilliant idea, don't you think? Using his desire for revenge against himself. The cherry on top will be when the authorities discover it was you who killed him. The resentful wife who married for money discovered dark secrets and decided to eliminate him. While Reed spoke, boasting of his plan, Alara noticed the small wooden box still open in the safe. Inside, something metallic reflected the light. What are we going to do now? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady while taking a small step toward the safe. Now you're going to call your dear husband, say you miss him, and ask when he'll return. We want him to hurry back, don't we? To his own funeral. At that moment, Alara acted. She threw the documents in Reed's face, diving toward the safe. Her fingers closed around the metallic object, an old gun that must have belonged to Xavier's father. Reed recovered quickly, pointing his gun. You fool. A shot echoed through the silent mansion. Alara felt a sharp pain in her shoulder but remained conscious, adrenaline coursing through her body. Taking advantage of Reed's momentary certainty that he had fatally hit her, she ran for the back door of the office. You have nowhere to go, Reed shouted, pursuing her through the corridors. Alara knew he was right. The mansion was huge but isolated. Mrs. Montgomery probably controlled security. Her only hope was to reach her room, where she kept her cell phone, and warn Xavier. Running through the winter garden that connected the wings of the mansion, Alara felt blood flowing down her arm. The pain was almost unbearable, but her fear for Xavier was greater. If Reed's plan was already in motion, every second counted. Blood dripped down Alara's arm, leaving a trail on the Persian carpet in the corridor leading to the east wing of the mansion. Her shoulder throbbed, but she forced herself to keep moving, aware of Reed's footsteps not far behind. You're only making this harder for yourself, his voice echoed through the corridors. Even if you managed to escape the mansion, where would you go? Who would believe you against me? Alara entered her room, quickly locking the door. She knew it would only delay him for a few minutes. With a trembling hand, she grabbed her cell phone from the nightstand and dialed Xavier's number. The call went straight to voicemail. Xavier, it's Alara, she whispered urgently while opening her closet and grabbing a backpack. You're in danger. Reed is behind everything. The death of our parents, the falsified research. He plans to kill you too. Don't return to the mansion. I found the real documents in your safe. I'll try to escape and bring the evidence with me. Please be careful. After hanging up, she quickly stuffed some clothes into the backpack, along with the most important documents she had taken from the safe. Using a clean t-shirt, she improvised a bandage for her shoulder wound, biting her lip to keep from screaming in pain. A loud sound came from the door. Reed was trying to break it down. Alara looked frantically around, assessing her options. The window overlooked the gardens, 2 floors below. A dangerous fall, but perhaps her only exit. When the door began to give way, she made her choice. She opened the window and looked outside. There was a trellis covered with ivy going down the wall, not too far from her reach. If she could jump and grab it. The door exploded, and Reed entered the room, his gun pointed directly at her. End of the line, dear niece. Why, uncle? Alara asked, buying time while positioning herself closer to the window. Why destroy so many lives? You would never understand. You always lived a privileged life, protected by your brilliant parents. While I, your father's older brother, was left behind. James was always the favorite, the family genius. I was just the administrator, the less talented brother who handled finances while he made revolutionary discoveries. The bitterness in Reed's voice was palpable. When I discovered the real potential of Project Renaissance, I saw my chance to finally be somebody, to be more important than my perfect little brother. By killing innocent people, necessary sacrifices for progress. Reed took a step forward. Now enough talk. Get away from the window. The moment he advanced, Alara threw the heavy lamp from her bedside table at him. The distraction was enough for her to launch herself out the window, desperately stretching to reach the trellis. Her fingers grabbed the interwoven vines, her body dangerously swinging in the air. The pain in her wounded shoulder was excruciating as she descended as quickly as possible, hearing Reed's furious shouts above. When she hit the ground, she saw lights turning on throughout the mansion. Mrs. Montgomery had probably alerted security. Alara ran through the gardens toward the garage. She didn't have keys to any of the cars, but she remembered the old bicycle she had seen stored there. It was her best hope for a quick escape. When she reached the garage, she found it locked. Without hesitation, she picked up a large stone and broke the side window, unlocking the door from inside. The bicycle was there, dusty but apparently functional. While grabbing the helmet hanging beside it, she heard voices approaching, guards following Mrs. Montgomery's orders to search for her. With her heart racing, Alara pedaled into the night, heading for the coastal road. Her destination was Newport, the nearest town, where she hoped to find help. But she knew that as soon as her escape was discovered, Reed would use all resources at his disposal to find her, including the police, who would probably consider her a suspect, not a victim. The night was cold, and with each pedal stroke, her shoulders sent waves of pain throughout her body. The improvised bandage was already soaked with blood, and Alara was beginning to feel dizzy. But fear kept her moving. Fear for her life, and even more, fear for Xavier, who might be heading straight into a trap. After nearly an hour of exhaustive pedaling, the lights of Newport finally appeared on the horizon. Alara knew she couldn't simply go to a hospital. It would be the first place Reed would look for her. She needed someone she could trust, someone beyond her uncle's reach. Then she remembered Catherine Parker, an old friend of her mother who lived in New York. Elizabeth always mentioned that if Alara ever needed help and had nowhere to go, Catherine would be trustworthy. Alara had never met her personally, but she had kept the number, a reminder of her mother's occasional paranoia that now seemed prophetic. Arriving at the Newport train station, Alara used the last of her money to buy a ticket to New York on the first morning train. She had a few hours to wait, time to try calling Xavier again. In a public bathroom at the station, she examined her wound more carefully. The bullet had gone through cleanly, but the blood loss was concerning. Using the first aid kit she found on the wall, she made a better bandage, gritting her teeth against the pain. She tried Xavier's cell phone several times, always going to voicemail. In her last effort, she called the reception of the Boston Hotel where she knew he usually stayed. Renaissance Boston Hotel, how may I help you? Answered a polite voice. Good evening. I'm trying to contact my husband, Xavier Blackwood. It's urgent. There was a pause on the other end of the line. I'm sorry, ma'am, but we don't have any guest registered under that name. Alara's heart sank. If Xavier wasn't at the hotel where he was supposedly staying, where was he? Had Reed already managed to reach him? Catherine Parker's apartment was in an elegant Art Deco building on the Upper West Side. When Alara rang the doorbell, she was exhausted, in pain, and suspicious. The last 24 hours had destroyed her trust in everything and everyone around her. The door opened, revealing a woman in her early 60s, short, elegant gray hair and penetrating blue eyes that widened at the sight of Alara's condition. My God, you're wounded, Catherine exclaimed, quickly pulling her inside. Is that a gunshot? Alara nodded weakly, surprised by the rapid identification of her injury. How did you? Let's take care of this first. Questions later, Catherine said firmly, leading her to the bathroom, where a complete professional medical kit was already prepared. With skilled hands, she cleaned, disinfected, and bandaged Alara's shoulder. You have medical experience, Alara observed as Catherine worked. Emergency doctor for 20 years before becoming a researcher. Catherine finished the bandage. Now, take this for the pain and tell me everything. In the next few minutes, Alara recounted the events of the past weeks. the forced contract with Xavier, the revelations about their family's past, and finally, Reed's betrayal and her discovery about Project Renaissance. Catherine listened in silence, her face growing more serious with each revelation. When Alara finished, she stood and walked to a bookshelf, removing a fake book that revealed a small safe. "Your mother gave me this almost 15 years ago, shortly before she died," she explained, withdrawing a flash drive and a thin folder. "She said if you ever came to me talking about Project Renaissance, I should give this to you. Not to anyone else, just to you personally." With trembling hands, Alara accepted the items. "Do you know what they are?" "Not specifically." Elizabeth was very cautious. "But I know she and James were involved in something revolutionary with the Blackwoods, a treatment that could regenerate damaged tissue, potentially curing neurodegenerative diseases, spinal cord injuries, even brain damage caused by strokes. And something went wrong." Alara completed, opening the folder. "Your mother began to suspect someone was manipulating the test results, accelerating the process for commercialization. She was terrified of the potential consequences, serious side effects that would only appear months after treatment." Inside the folder, Alara found a letter addressed to her, in her mother's elegant handwriting. "My dear Alara, if you're reading this, then my worst suspicions have been confirmed. Your father and I discovered evidence that Reed is falsifying Project Renaissance test results, in collusion with external investors who want to commercialize the treatment prematurely. Xavier Sr. discovered part of the scheme too. We're gathering enough evidence to expose everything, but Reed has dangerous connections. If anything happens to us, all the evidence is on this flash drive, encrypted with a password only you would know, the name of the constellation we observed together on your 6th birthday. There's something else you need to know. The agreement between our family and the Blackwoods was never about business or company mergers. Xavier Sr. and I discovered that you and his son possess a rare genetic marker that is crucial for the final stabilization of the Renaissance formula. The marriage agreement was a way to ensure that you two would eventually meet and, perhaps, have children whose genetic material would complete the research. It seems medieval and manipulative now, but it began with the best intentions. When we realized the mistake we'd made, Xavier Sr. and I decided to break the agreement. We promised that you two would be free to choose your own paths. If Xavier's son still lives, tell him his father died trying to protect the truth. Just as, I fear, your father and I may have when you read this. With all my love, forever. Mom. P.S. Catherine knows the truth about the connection, but swore never to reveal it until you came to her. Trust her. She can help." Tears streamed down Alara's face as she finished reading. "Eridanus," she whispered. The constellation was Eridanus, the same date she had used to open Xavier's safe. Connecting the flash drive to the laptop Catherine offered, Alara entered the password. A series of documents, videos, and emails opened, the complete evidence of Reed's conspiracy, including secret recordings of meetings where he clearly discussed falsifying data with foreign investors. "What is the connection that my mother mentions?" Alara asked, turning to Catherine. The older woman sighed deeply before answering. "Something that Xavier Sr. and Elizabeth discovered by accident. You and the younger Xavier aren't just genetically compatible for Project Renaissance. You're what we call mirror souls." Mirror souls? That sounds like something from a fantasy novel. It's a rare neurological phenomenon that Xavier Sr. was studying parallel to the main project. Some people possess brain patterns that are complementary, creating extraordinary synchronicity when they're close. More intense emotions, greater empathy, even shared physical sensations. Alara remembered the kiss during the ball, the instant and inexplicable connection she had felt, even while hating Xavier at the time. Is this real? Scientifically proven. Xavier Sr. was just beginning to document the phenomenon. He discovered it accidentally when he did brain scans on you and his son as children. The patterns were almost perfect mirrors of each other. Catherine hesitated. Reed discovered this research too. That's why he orchestrated the forced marriage, not just to unite the families and gain access to the main research, but because he knows that, together, you and Xavier could complete the Renaissance puzzle. So it's not about revenge or old promises. It's about our DNA, our brains. The revelation left Alara dizzy. Reed manipulated Xavier, used his pain and desire for revenge to make him believe his parents were betrayed by the Morgans. In reality, they were all working together until Reed betrayed everyone. Alara was absorbing these revelations when her cell phone rang, an unknown number. With hesitation, she answered. Alara. Xavier's voice, tense and low, made her heart leap. Xavier. Thank God. Where are you? Are you okay? I'm fine, but I had to disappear. I got your message and started investigating. You were right about everything. Reed, the conspiracy, all of it. How did you find me? I traced your phone, he admitted. A habit I implemented when we got married. I know it's invasive, but now I'm grateful for it. At any other time, Alara would have been furious about this privacy violation, but now she felt only relief. Reed is looking for both of us, Xavier continued. He's already involved the police, saying you stole confidential documents and might be unstable after discovering supposed infidelities of mine. Typical, Alara sighed. Xavier, I'm with Catherine Parker, a friend of my mother's. I've discovered so many things about our parents, about the project, about us. I've discovered things too. We need to meet, but it has to be somewhere safe. Xavier's voice lowered even more. Do you trust this Catherine? Alara looked at the woman who had treated her wound and guarded her mother's secrets for 15 years. Yes, I trust her. Good. There's a place no one but me knows about, an old observatory that belonged to my family in the Berkshire Mountains. Catherine might know where it is. Meet me there tomorrow at noon. After hanging up, Alara relayed the plan to Catherine, who nodded. The Blackwood Observatory. I know exactly where it is. Xavier Sr. took me there once, when we were all working together. She walked to a drawer and retrieved a small object. But before we go, take this. It was a small gun, discreet but lethal. I don't trust coincidences, Catherine explained. Xavier disappearing from his hotel, finding you so quickly. Reed is manipulative. We don't know how much Xavier really knows. You think it could be a trap? Alara asked, reluctant to distrust Xavier after everything they'd been through. I hope not, dear. But your mother taught me to always have a plan B. Catherine packed a few more items in a bag. Rest a bit. We'll leave at dawn. The next morning, they began the 3-hour journey to the Berkshire Mountains, Massachusetts. During the trip, Alara studied the documents on her mother's flash drive more closely, discovering the true extent of Reed's conspiracy. It wasn't just about money. It was about power. Project Renaissance, if properly developed, could revolutionize medicine. But in the wrong hands, modified as Reed planned, it could be turned into a biological weapon with devastating effects. That's why my parents were so desperate to stop him, Alara murmured, finally connecting all the pieces. It wasn't just about medical ethics. It was about global security. The Blackwood Observatory appeared on the horizon as they approached the top of an isolated hill. A circular stone structure crowned by a copper dome turned green with age. It seemed abandoned, but Alara noticed subtle signs of recent maintenance. We're early, Catherine observed, parking at a distance. Let's watch for a while before approaching. For almost an hour, they observed the observatory in silence, looking for any sign of danger or trap. Finally, exactly at noon, a solitary car drove up the dirt road, parking near the entrance. Xavier got out, alone, looking cautiously around. Alara felt her heart race seeing him. Disheveled hair, unshaven, tired appearance. But alive, safe. Against her own will, she realized how much she had feared never seeing him again. Let's go, she said to Catherine, who nodded gravely. They approached slowly, remaining visible. Xavier turned at the sound of their footsteps, and for a fleeting moment, an expression of pure relief crossed his face upon seeing Alara. But his gaze quickly hardened when he noticed Catherine. Who are you? He asked sharply. Catherine Parker. I worked with your parents and the Morgans on the original project. She maintained a cautious distance, her hand discreetly close to the bag where she'd kept the gun. Xavier studied her for a moment before nodding. My father mentioned you in his journals. The neurology specialist who left the project when human testing began. I left when I realized protocols were being violated, Catherine corrected. When I suspected someone was falsifying data. Reed, Xavier completed, turning to Alara. His eyes traveled over her bandaged shoulder. He did this to you? Alara nodded. He confessed everything, Xavier. About killing our parents, falsifying documents, manipulating you against my family. He even hired Mrs. Montgomery to spy on you from the beginning. Xavier exhaled deeply. as if confirming his own suspicions. I discovered part of this after receiving your message. I started investigating discreetly and found evidence of financial transfers between a subsidiary company of Reed's and some of my trusted people. His face hardened. I was completely manipulated. We all were. Elara stepped forward. But now we have all the proof. My mother's flash drive, the documents from your safe, the recordings. It won't be that simple, Xavier interrupted. Reed has powerful connections, politicians, judges, even within federal agencies. And now he's using all resources to find us. So what do we do? Asked Elara. Xavier looked at the observatory. First, we need to complete what our parents started. He pulled a small device from his pocket. This is the final component of the original research, the part my father hid here before he died. Elara, did you bring the digital version of the latest tests? She nodded, taking the flash drive from her bag. If we can combine the data, create the complete and legitimate formula for Renaissance, we'll have a weapon against Reed, one he can't ignore or suppress. Inside the observatory, Xavier led them to a basement lab revealed by a hidden door behind an old bookshelf. My father built this laboratory for private work, he explained, activating systems that slowly came to life after years of dormancy. It's completely shielded, with its own generator and independent satellite connection. Over the next few hours, the three worked intensely combining the fragmented data. Elara, with her knowledge of biochemistry, focused on the botanical properties of a crucial natural compound. Xavier analyzed the genetic sequences and computational algorithms. Catherine reviewed the test protocols and neurological results. It's amazing, Elara murmured, observing how the different parts fit together perfectly. Our parents created a masterpiece. And Reed almost turned it into a weapon, Xavier added grimly. As the sun began to set, illuminating the observatory dome with amber and gold tones, they finally completed the reconstruction of the original project. The complete Renaissance formula now existed again, this time without Reed's dangerous modifications. And now? Elara asked, exhausted but triumphant. Now we need to release this publicly, where Reed can't suppress it, said Xavier. All the research, all the evidence of his manipulations, all at once. It won't be enough, Catherine warned. He could still claim the documents are falsified, that you're trying to steal from him. Then we need the final component, said Xavier, looking significantly at Elara. What makes our DNA so special for this formula? Elara hesitated. The mirror connection. Xavier nodded slowly. My father documented this partially. Our minds work in a kind of synchronicity. That's why. The kiss was so intense, Elara completed, feeling her face flush. It felt like something had awakened inside me. Exactly. And that's what will complete the formula and create the final catalyst that's missing. Xavier approached, taking her hands in his. But it requires greater synchronicity than we've had so far. The moment was interrupted by the shrill sound of an alarm. Catherine ran to a security monitor. We have company, she announced gravely. A lot of company. The external cameras showed several black SUVs climbing the dirt road, armed men descending from the vehicles. Leading them, easily recognizable even in the grainy image, was Reed.